You're a loser." Judge Rebecca Collins said it without blinking her voice, cutting across the courtroom like a verdict had already been decided. She looked down at Jacob Miller, the man sitting alone at the defendant's table, and let the silence do the rest of the work. She mocked his old pickup truck, his 2 jobs, his modest house. Olivia, his ex-wife, smiled from across the room. But then, an elderly woman in the back row stood up. Then a veteran. Then a nurse. One by one, the entire room rose not for the judge, but for him. What had this man done that no one in that courtroom could stay seated? Jacob Miller was 42 years old and had never once asked anyone to feel sorry for him. That wasn't stubbornness, it was just the way he was built. He woke up before 5, most mornings made coffee in a dented percolator, and drove his old pickup truck through the quiet streets of Dayton, Ohio, before the rest of the neighborhood had even opened their eyes. The truck had over 200,000 miles on it, and a crack running along the bottom of the passenger window that he kept meaning to fix. He never got around to it, because there was always something else that needed doing. First, a leaking pipe under the kitchen sink, a section of fence in the backyard that had started to lean a neighbor who needed something before Jacob needed anything for himself. He worked days at a warehouse on the east side of town, loading and unloading freight. And 3 nights a week, he picked up a second shift at a hardware store 15 minutes away. The warehouse work was physical and repetitive, the kind of work that ages a body slowly and honestly. The hardware store was quieter. He spent most of those shifts restocking shelves and helping customers find what they needed. He was good at it. He knew where everything was, and he never made people feel stupid for asking. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the life he'd imagined for himself when he was younger. But it was honest. And Jacob Miller had long ago decided that honesty was worth more than comfort. The house he lived in was small, 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, a backyard that backed up against a chain-link fence. But it was his. Or at least it was supposed to be. The divorce had been finalized 3 years earlier, and by the terms of the settlement, the house on Carver Street had been awarded to Jacob. He and Olivia had agreed on it. They had both signed the paperwork in front of a notary, in front of their respective attorneys, and the agreement had been filed with the court without contest. At the time, Olivia had seemed relieved to be done with it. She had moved into an apartment across town, picked up with a new social circle, and by all appearances had moved on completely. Jacob had done the same in his quieter way. He fixed the gutters, repainted the front porch, and started keeping a small garden along the south side of the house, where he grew tomatoes in the summer and kept the soil turned even in the months when nothing was growing. He didn't talk about the divorce. He didn't need to. What Jacob did instead was show up for people. It was never something he planned or announced. Just happened the way water finds cracks. When his neighbor Frank Doyle, a veteran in his late 60s, who lived alone 3 doors down, came home from a hospital stay with a busted knee and couldn't manage his lawn, Jacob started mowing it without being asked. He did it for 4 months straight every Saturday morning, without accepting so much as a handshake in return. Frank had tried to wave him off the first few times, telling him he didn't need the charity. Jacob told him it wasn't charity, it was just mowing a lawn, and showed up the following Saturday the same as before. After the 3rd week, Frank stopped arguing and started leaving a bottle of water on the porch railing for Jacob when he arrived. When Ruth Harding, the elderly woman who lived at the end of the block, had her furnace break down in January, Jacob spent an entire Sunday afternoon crawling around her basement until he found the fault and fixed it. The temperature outside had been in the single digits, and Ruth had been heating her living room with a space heater and 2 wool blankets. Jacob replaced a faulty igniter, bled the system, and waited until the heat was running evenly through the house before he packed up his tools. Ruth had tried to press $40 into his hand when he was done. He told her to keep it and buy herself something warm to eat. There was a nurse named Sandra Pierce who lived 2 streets over and worked double shifts at the county hospital. She had mentioned once in passing at a neighborhood block gathering that her car had been making a grinding noise for weeks, and she hadn't had time to deal with it. She laughed it off the way people laugh off problems they've been ignoring too long. Jacob showed up the following Saturday with his toolbox, diagnosed a worn brake pad on the front left wheel, and replaced it in under 2 hours. Sandra came out of the house while he was finishing up, and stood in the driveway looking at him like she wasn't quite sure what to say. She offered to pay him. He told her she already did enough for other people and left it at that. These were not grand gestures. They were the small, unglamorous kind of help that most people promise and never follow through on. Jacob just followed through. He didn't post about it. He didn't mention it to anyone. He fixed what needed fixing, showed up when someone needed someone to show up, and went back to his own life without making anyone feel like they owed him anything. None of this made him wealthy or well-connected. It didn't get his name in the local paper or earn him any recognition from the city. He was still the man with the cracked truck window and the 2 jobs and the small house on Carver Street. But the people in that neighborhood knew who he was. They knew what kind of man he was, and they remembered. Olivia Miller had a different kind of memory. Hers was selective in the way that convenient things always are. By the time 3 years had passed since the divorce, she had rewritten the story of their marriage into something that positioned her entirely as the victim of Jacob's lack of ambition, of his modest income, of his refusal to chase a bigger life. She had wanted more. A larger home, a different zip code, the kind of social standing that came with money and the right last name. Jacob had never pretended to be something he wasn't, and Olivia had come to see that honesty as a personal failure on his part. She surrounded herself with people who agreed with her, and over time, she began to believe deeply and completely that she had been cheated out of the life she deserved. The version of Jacob that existed in her mind had become so different from the actual man that she could speak about him with complete conviction and be entirely wrong about almost everything. The lawsuit arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered to Jacob's front door by a process server who handed him an envelope and walked away before Jacob could say a word. He stood in the doorway and read it twice, because the first time through, he was certain he had misunderstood. Olivia was filing a motion to vacate the original divorce settlement. She was claiming that she had been coerced into signing the property agreement 3 years earlier, that she had not fully understood its terms, and that the house on Carver Street rightfully belonged to her. She was asking the court to reverse the settlement and transfer the deed to her name. Jacob set the envelope down on the kitchen counter and stood very still for a long moment. He thought about the day they had both signed the paperwork. He thought about the attorneys who had been present, the notary who had witnessed every signature, the copy of the agreement he still had filed in a manila folder in the top drawer of his desk. He had done everything right. He had followed every step of the legal process exactly as required. And now, 3 years later, Olivia was standing in front of a courthouse door, claiming none of it had been legitimate. He called an attorney that same afternoon, a man named Gary Sutton, who had handled some of the original divorce proceedings. Sutton listened carefully, asked for a copy of the filing, and called Jacob back the following morning. His tone was measured, but not reassuring. The claim itself was thin, Sutton said. The original agreement was solid and well documented. Under normal circumstances, a motion like this would have a very low chance of success. But then Sutton told him something that changed the weight of the entire conversation. The case had been assigned to Judge Rebecca Collins. Jacob didn't recognize the name immediately, but Sutton filled in the details in the careful, reluctant way that lawyers deliver bad news. Rebecca Collins and Olivia Miller had known each other for years. They moved in the same social circles, had been photographed together at charity events and fundraisers, and by several accounts were close personal friends. Sutton was careful not to say anything that could be construed as an accusation. He spoke in the language of risk and probability, but the message underneath was clear. The playing field was not level, and Jacob needed to understand that before he decided how to proceed. Sutton also mentioned quietly that 2 other attorneys he respected had already passed on the case without explaining why. That detail sat in Jacob's chest long after the call ended. Jacob sat with that information for 2 days before he gave Sutton his answer. He thought about walking away. He thought about what it would mean to hand Olivia the house just to avoid a fight that might be impossible to win. He thought about the garden along the south wall, the front porch he had repainted twice the furnace he had replaced on his own because he couldn't afford a contractor. He thought about the months he had worked double shifts to make the mortgage payments without falling behind, even when it meant eating rice and canned soup for 2 weeks at a stretch. He thought about all of it. Then he called Sutton back and told him to prepare for trial. It was not a decision made from anger. Jacob wasn't built for anger. In that way, he didn't simmer or scheme. He made the decision the same way he made every other decision in his life, by looking at what was true and deciding he wasn't willing to pretend otherwise. The house was his. The agreement was legal. He had done nothing wrong. And as long as those things were true, he was not going to sign them away because the situation had gotten complicated. What he couldn't fully account for, not yet, was how complicated it was about to become. He didn't know in those first days after receiving the lawsuit how far things would go. He didn't know about the conversations that had already taken place between Olivia and the judge before the case had even been formally scheduled. He didn't know that some of the attorneys he would approach for a second opinion had already quietly stepped back from the case for reasons they wouldn't fully explain. He just knew what was true, and he held on to that. The way a man holds on to something solid in the middle of moving water, not because it makes the current stop, but because it's the only thing worth holding. The first pretrial hearing was set for 6 weeks out. Jacob spent those weeks gathering his documents, organizing his records, and meeting with Sutton to build the clearest possible version of the case. Sutton was a competent attorney, and he was thorough, but Jacob noticed that he spoke about the proceedings with the specific kind of caution reserved for situations where the outcome is already uncertain for reasons that have nothing to do with the facts. He never said it outright, but Jacob had spent enough time around working people to recognize when someone was managing expectations rather than expressing confidence. The night before the first hearing, Jacob sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and the original divorce settlement spread out in front of him. Every page was signed. Every signature was witnessed. Every date matched. He had read it so many times in the past 6 weeks that he could have recited sections of it from memory. He folded it carefully, put it back in the manila folder, and set it on the counter next to his keys so he wouldn't forget it in the morning. He went to bed at 10:30. He set his alarm for 5, the same as every other day. He didn't sleep particularly well, but he didn't lie awake catastrophizing either. He had made his decision. Now he would go see it through. What Jacob Miller could not have anticipated, what no reasonable person could have predicted, sitting alone at a kitchen table in a small house in Dayton, Ohio, was that the most powerful voices in his defense were already out there, scattered across the neighborhood, going about their own lives, with no idea. Yet that they were about to be called upon. Frank Doyle was watching the evening news 2 streets over. Ruth Harding was reading in her armchair, under a lamp by the window. Sandra Pierce was finishing a night shift at the hospital and driving home in the car with the brakes that no longer ground when she pressed the pedal. None of them knew what was coming, but they all knew Jacob Miller, and that, in the end, would turn out to be the most important fact of the entire case. The first hearing was nothing like a search for truth. Jacob understood that within the first 20 minutes of sitting in that courtroom, Rebecca Collins entered from the side door and took her seat at the bench with the kind of practiced authority that comes from years of being the most powerful person in a room. She was well-dressed, sharp-featured, and carried herself with the particular confidence of someone who rarely gets challenged. She reviewed the case documents without looking up, and when she finally did look up, her eyes went to Olivia's table first and stayed there a moment too long. It was a small thing. Most people in the room probably didn't notice, Jacob noticed. Gary Sutton had prepared a clean, well-organized opening submission. The original settlement agreement was properly executed, witnessed, notarized, and filed. There was no legal basis for the claim of coercion. No evidence had been presented. No witnesses named. No documentation offered. The motion to vacate, Sutton argued, did not meet the threshold required to reopen a finalized divorce decree. It was a straightforward argument, because the facts were straightforward. Jacob watched the judge's face while Sutton spoke and saw nothing there. Not consideration, not engagement, not even the performance of attention. She was already somewhere else. When Olivia's attorney rose to speak, Rebecca Collins leaned forward slightly. Her expression shifted not dramatically, just enough. The attorney's name was Martin Hale, a polished man in an expensive suit who spoke in the smooth, unhurried rhythm of someone accustomed to being believed. He described Olivia as a woman who had been pressured into signing documents during an emotionally vulnerable period, who had not fully grasped the legal implications of what she was agreeing to, and who had only recently come to understand the full extent of what she had lost. He did not offer any evidence for any of this. He offered narrative delivered with conviction, and Rebecca Collins received it like it was testimony. Sutton objected twice during the submission. Both objections were overruled without explanation. When Sutton requested that the court acknowledge the notarized record of consent, Rebecca dismissed it as preliminary and said the matter would be addressed in due course. It was not addressed. The hearing ended with a scheduling order for a full evidentiary proceeding and a directive that both parties submit additional filings within 30 days. Jacob walked out of the courthouse with his folder under his arm and the distinct, nauseating feeling that the outcome of this case had been decided before he ever set foot in the room. Sutton walked beside him down the courthouse steps and said carefully that it was just the first hearing and that nothing had been determined yet. Jacob nodded. He didn't argue. But he had spent enough of his life doing physical work to know the difference between a fair load and a rigged one, and he knew which one he was carrying. He had watched the way Rebecca's pen moved across her notepad when Hale was speaking versus when Sutton was speaking. She wrote things down for one of them and nothing for the other. That told him everything he needed to know about how the next several months were going to feel. The weeks that followed were grinding in the specific way that legal proceedings grind slowly, expensively, and with no visible progress. Jacob submitted every document Sutton requested. He pulled out bank records, mortgage statements, the original settlement agreement, correspondence from the period of the divorce, and anything else that demonstrated the straightforward and consensual nature of what had been agreed to 3 years earlier. Sutton filed everything with the court and received back a series of procedural responses that deferred, delayed, or partially dismissed each piece of evidence without engaging with its substance. It was like pushing against something that gave slightly just enough to absorb the pressure and then returned to exactly where it had been. Jacob kept working through all of it. He still showed up at the warehouse before dawn. He still worked his evening shifts at the hardware store. He still stopped by Frank Doyle's house when he had the time, still checked in on Ruth Harding when the weather turned cold. The legal proceedings had upended a significant portion of his life, but they had not changed who he was or how he moved through his days. That consistency, the refusal to let the weight of the case bend him into someone different, was the one thing he could control, and he held on to it deliberately. Meanwhile, at the pre-trial conferences, Jacob was not present for Olivia's team, continued to build a portrait of Jacob as a man who had taken advantage of a distressed woman. The word coercion appeared in every filing. There was still no supporting documentation, no statements from the original attorneys, no records of any complaint filed at the time of the divorce, no evidence of any kind that Olivia had expressed reluctance or confusion before, during, or immediately after the signing. There was only the assertion repeated with enough consistency that it began to function like a fact, simply by virtue of being restated. Jacob read the filings when Sutton forwarded them and felt something he could only describe as a particular kind of exhaustion. Not physical tiredness, but the specific fatigue of watching a false story about yourself accumulate detail it was never entitled to. Jacob found out about the community letters by accident. He had stopped by Frank Doyle's house one evening to drop off a bag of groceries. Frank's knee had been giving him trouble again, and he'd mentioned he hadn't been able to get to the store, and Frank had met him at the door holding a sheet of paper. He told Jacob he'd heard about the lawsuit through the neighborhood and that he'd written something down. He wanted Jacob to have it. Jacob looked at the letter. It was handwritten 2 pages, in the careful block printing of a man who had learned to write in the military and never lost the habit. It described in plain and specific terms the months Jacob had spent mowing his lawn after his hospital stay, the fact that Jacob had never accepted payment or asked for anything in return, and Frank's personal assessment of Jacob's character as a man of integrity. Frank said he'd be willing to say it in court if it would help. Jacob drove home that night with the letter on the passenger seat and didn't fully know what to do with the feeling it gave him. It wasn't relief exactly. It was something quieter, the recognition that he had not been as alone in this as the proceedings had made him feel. He had spent months absorbing the legal system's version of himself, the one that Olivia's filings had constructed, and Frank's letter reminded him that there was another version, built from actual events by people who had actually been there. Over the following 2 weeks, more letters arrived. Ruth Harding wrote one, describing the January night Jacob had fixed her furnace and refused any payment. Her letter was short but specific. She named the date, described the temperature, and noted that Jacob had stayed until the heat was running properly through every room before he left. Sandra Pierce submitted a written statement to Sutton's office without Jacob even asking, documenting the brake repair and adding several other instances. She remembered where Jacob had shown up for neighbors in ways that went unannounced and uncompensated. Margaret Webb, a retired teacher who had lived across the street for over a decade, wrote a letter that was measured and precise in the way that teachers tend to be. She listed specific dates, specific events, and offered her professional judgment that Jacob Miller was not a man who manipulated or pressured anyone. Dale Cooper, who ran the hardware store where Jacob worked his evening shifts, submitted a statement about Jacob's reliability, his honesty with customers, and 3 separate occasions where Jacob had personally helped elderly shoppers load heavy items into their vehicles without being asked or thanked. Sutton compiled all of it and worked it into the evidentiary record. It wasn't the kind of evidence that proved a legal point directly. It was character evidence, a picture of a man built from dozens of small, consistent actions over many years. Sutton told Jacob it was useful but not decisive. What they still needed, he said, was something that addressed the procedural problem directly. Something that spoke to the arrangement, not just the man. That something arrived from a direction Jacob had not expected. A man named Paul Garrett contacted Sutton's office through the firm's general inquiry line. Garrett identified himself as a former employee of Martin Hale's law firm, Olivia's attorney, where he had worked in an administrative capacity until leaving the firm several months earlier. He said he had information relevant to the case and that he was willing to share it, but only in a formal setting where his statement would be on record. Sutton arranged a meeting within 48 hours. What Paul Garrett described in a conference room with Sutton and Jacob present was a series of private communications between Olivia Miller and Judge Rebecca Collins that had taken place before the case had ever been formally filed. He had not been directly involved in those communications, but his position in the firm had given him access to information that was not meant to be widely known. He had seen correspondence. He had overheard conversations in hallways and in rooms where people forgot he was present. He had watched the decision to pursue the lawsuit follow almost immediately from what appeared to be an agreement that the outcome would be favorable. He couldn't prove every detail, he said, but he knew what he had seen, and he had carried it for long enough that the weight of staying silent had finally become heavier than the risk of speaking. Jacob sat in that conference room and listened without speaking. He had suspected it from the beginning, the feeling in the first hearing, the way the judge's eyes had moved the pattern of dismissals that didn't track with the legal record. But suspecting something and hearing it described by someone who had been inside the room were two different things. He felt for the first time since receiving the lawsuit that there was something real to hold on to. Not comfort exactly, but ground. The pressure did not let up. If anything, it intensified. Rebecca Collins accelerated the timeline for the final hearing, scheduling it for a date that gave Sutton less preparation time than was standard for an evidentiary proceeding of this complexity. When Sutton filed a motion requesting a reasonable extension, it was denied within 24 hours, faster than most routine motions were even reviewed. Two of the community members who had offered to testify in person told Sutton's office that they had been approached by individuals they didn't know and strongly discouraged from appearing in court. They didn't use the word threatened, but both of them withdrew their offers to appear as live witnesses, though they left their written statements in the record. A local news outlet ran a short piece on the case, framed around the angle of a woman seeking to reclaim property she felt had been wrongfully taken from her in a coercive divorce settlement. The article quoted Olivia's attorney at length. It did not contact Jacob or Sutton for comment before publishing. The story didn't go wide, it was local and small, but it landed in the neighborhood, and Jacob spent 2 days quietly aware that people were reading it and forming opinions based on a version of events that bore almost no resemblance to what had actually happened. Olivia's attorney sent a settlement offer through formal channels. The terms were simple. Jacob would transfer the deed to the house on Carver Street to Olivia, and in exchange, she would withdraw all current and future legal claims against him. No money would change hands. He would simply leave. Sutton presented the offer without recommending either way, which was the ethical thing to do, and then said quietly that it was Jacob's decision entirely. Jacob looked at the offer for a long time. He thought about the furnace he'd replaced, the porch he'd repainted, the garden he'd put in along the south wall. He thought about Frank Doyle's handwritten letter and the careful block printing it was written in. He thought about Ruth Harding naming the exact date and the exact temperature in her statement. He thought about Sandra Pierce driving home from a night shift in a car with brakes that now worked properly. He thought about Paul Garrett sitting across a conference table with information he didn't have to share, but chose to because the weight of staying silent had become too much. He thought about all the ways this case had tried to make him feel small, the dismissals, the accelerated timeline, the news article, the people told not to show up, and how none of it had changed what was actually true. He told Sutton to decline the offer. The final hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late November. Jacob drove to the courthouse in his old pickup truck, the one with the cracked passenger window and the 200,000 miles on it. He parked in the same lot he always used, carried his folder inside, and took his seat at the defendant's table alone. The room filled up around him. He looked straight ahead. He did not look at Olivia's table. He did not look at the bench. He looked at the far wall of the courtroom and waited for whatever was coming next, the same way he had always waited for hard things, without flinching, without pretending it wasn't hard, and without any intention of walking away from it. Rebecca Collins opened the final hearing the same way she had opened every preceding session, with the air of someone performing a role they had already decided the ending of. She reviewed the submitted materials from the bench with what looked like thoroughness, but moved too quickly to be genuine. Martin Hale sat beside Olivia at the plaintiff's table, looking composed and unhurried. Gary Sutton sat beside Jacob and kept his hands flat on the table. The courtroom was more full than Jacob had expected. He had not told anyone to come. The early portion of the hearing proceeded in a pattern Jacob had grown familiar with over the preceding months. Sutton raised the evidentiary record, the original settlement agreement, the notarized signatures, the correspondence from the period of the divorce, the complete absence of any documented complaint filed by Olivia at any point in the 3 years between the signing and the lawsuit. Rebecca acknowledged each item with a nod that carried no weight. When Martin Hale presented Olivia's counter-narrative, the same story of emotional vulnerability and incomplete understanding that had appeared in every filing since the beginning, Rebecca listened with visible attention. She asked Hale 2 clarifying questions. She asked Sutton none. Then Rebecca Collins turned to address the courtroom directly, and what she said landed in the room like something thrown hard against a wall. She looked at Jacob and stated in a voice that did not drop or soften that in her experience, on the bench she had seen many men like him, men who believed that doing the bare minimum entitled them to sympathy, men who confused stubbornness with integrity, men who drove old trucks and worked 2 jobs and expected the world to applaud them for it. She used the word loser without hesitation, as if it were a legal term with a precise definition. She said that men like Jacob always found ways to frame their failures as someone else's fault, and that the court was not a place for that kind of self-pity. She said it with the particular ease of someone who had never expected to be contradicted. Olivia did not turn to look at Jacob when the judge said it. She didn't need to. The satisfaction was already visible in the set of her shoulders, in the way she held her pen, without writing anything, in the small adjustment she made to her posture, that read like someone settling in to watch something conclude in their favor. Martin Hale kept his expression neutral, in the practiced way of attorneys, who have learned not to react visibly to things that are going well for their client. Jacob did not respond. He kept his eyes forward and his hand still on the table. Whatever he felt in that moment, he kept it inside the way he kept most things not buried, just contained the way you contain something that belongs to you, and that no one else has the right to touch. He had heard worse said about him over the course of these proceedings. He had read worse in the filings. None of it had changed the facts, and the facts were the only thing he had come here to defend. Sutton leaned close and said quietly that he wanted to enter Paul Garrett's formal statement into the record before the judge moved to ruling. Rebecca looked up from her papers and said the statement had already been reviewed and would be given appropriate consideration, which was the kind of language that meant it would be set aside. Sutton pressed the point, stating for the record that the statement contained direct references to ex parte communications between the plaintiff and the presiding judge prior to the filing of the case. The room went slightly quieter. Rebecca's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes did a tightening brief and controlled. She opened her mouth to respond. She was still forming her answer when the movement began at the back of the courtroom. Ruth Harding stood up first. She was in her mid-70s, small, and she rose slowly using the back of the bench in front of her for support. When she was fully upright, she said clearly enough for the room to hear that she would like to speak on behalf of Jacob Miller. Rebecca told her that public comment was not a feature of civil proceedings and that she should be seated. Ruth Harding did not sit down. She said she understood that, and that she was not a lawyer, but that she had lived on Carver Street for 23 years, and she was not willing to sit quietly while a man she knew to be decent was spoken to the way Jacob had just been spoken to. She said Jacob had fixed her furnace on a Sunday in January, when the temperature outside was in the single digits, and that he had refused the $40 she tried to give him, and that, in her experience, a man who behaved that way in private when no one was watching and there was nothing to gain was not the man. This courtroom was being asked to believe he was. Rebecca told her a second time to sit down. Before the judge could say anything further, Frank Doyle stood up from a bench 3 rows behind Ruth. Frank was broad-shouldered, even in his late 60s, and when he stood, the room noticed. He said his name clearly said that he was a veteran, and that he had known Jacob Miller for 4 years. He said Jacob had mowed his lawn every Saturday for 4 months after a knee surgery, without ever being asked, without accepting a single dollar in return, and without once mentioning it to anyone else in the neighborhood. He said he had submitted a written letter to the court and wanted it known in this room and on this day that he stood behind every word in it. Rebecca's voice went sharp. She told both of them they were in violation of proper courtroom procedure, and that if they did not sit down, she would have the room cleared. Neither of them sat down. The bailiff looked toward the bench for guidance and received none that was actionable, because clearing a room full of quietly standing people required a different kind of authority than the judge currently had available to her. Sandra Pierce stood up from the middle of the room. She identified herself as a registered nurse and confirmed that she had submitted a written statement to the court and was present to stand behind it. She described the Saturday Jacob had appeared at her car without being asked, repaired her brakes, and left without accepting payment. She said she had worked in emergency medicine long enough to know the difference between someone who performed kindness for an audience and someone who did it because it was simply who they were, and that Jacob Miller was the second kind, without any question. Margaret Webb rose from the left side of the room. She had been a teacher for 31 years, and she spoke like it measured deliberate, making direct eye contact with the bench as she described specific dates and specific events she had witnessed over the decade she had lived across the street from Jacob. She did not raise her voice. She did not editorialize. She simply stated what she had seen, in the precise and unhurried way of someone who has spent a career making sure information lands clearly. Dale Cooper stood up next without preamble and spoke about a man who showed up to work on time every shift for years, who treated every customer with patience, and who had helped people carry heavy loads out to their vehicles on 3 occasions that Cooper could name specifically without being asked and without expecting anything for it. One by one, more people rose. Some of them Jacob recognized immediately. Some he only vaguely placed a face from the neighborhood, someone he had helped carry something, once a woman whose gutters he had cleared one autumn afternoon when he noticed they were overflowing and she wasn't home. They rose without coordination, without a signal, without any apparent plan, beyond the shared decision that they were not willing to remain seated, while something untrue was being treated as settled. Rebecca Collins called for order. She raised her voice twice more. She threatened to clear the room. The threat had no visible effect. What was happening was not a disruption in the conventional sense. It was quiet and orderly and patient, which made it considerably harder to address than noise would have been. In the midst of it, Gary Sutton rose formally and requested that the court take judicial notice of Paul Garrett's statement in light of the public record now being established in that room. He said it clearly and directly, and this time because of everything happening around him, the standing people, the phones that had come out in the gallery, the journalist in the back row who had arrived for a different case and was now writing very quickly. It could not simply be waved away. The record of this moment was being made in real time by more than one party. Rebecca Collins called a recess. She disappeared through the side door, and the room held its position. The people who had stood remained standing. The people who were seated did not move. Jacob sat at the defendant's table and looked at the space directly in front of him. He did not turn around. He did not look at Olivia. He sat with the weight of what was at his back, those people who had come without being summoned, and tried to hold himself steady against it. He was not a man who cried easily, and he did not cry then. But he felt something shift in him, some calcification that had been building for months, and it loosened in a way he hadn't been prepared for. The recess lasted 40 minutes. When Rebecca Collins returned to the bench, she did not look the same as when she had left. The ease was gone. In its place was a precision that read as controlled damage management, the expression of someone who has been informed during a recess that the situation has changed in ways that cannot be undone. She stated that the court would take Paul Garrett's statement under formal advisement, and that given the questions raised regarding procedural propriety, she was referring the matter to the Judicial Oversight Office for a preliminary review before any ruling was issued. She delivered it in the flat, careful language of someone reading from a script they did not write and did not want to read aloud. The Judicial Oversight Office moved faster than anyone anticipated. Within 10 days of the referral, a formal inquiry had been opened into the conduct of the proceedings. Paul Garrett's statement was entered into the inquiry record, along with documentation of the communications between Olivia and the judge that he had described. Rebecca Collins was placed on administrative leave from the case pending the outcome of the investigation. The case was reassigned to the Honorable Thomas Briggs, a man with a 20-year record on the bench, no known connection to either party, and a reputation for reading case files with the kind of attention that left no room for ambiguity. Judge Briggs reviewed the complete record in under a week. He did not schedule additional hearings. He did not request new filings. The legal question at the center of the case was not complicated once it was being examined by someone with no stake in the outcome. The original divorce settlement between Jacob Miller and Olivia Miller had been properly executed, properly witnessed, properly filed, and was fully binding under Ohio law. The motion to vacate presented no credible evidence of coercion and did not meet the legal standard required to reopen a finalized decree. Judge Briggs issued his ruling in writing on a Wednesday morning, and the language was direct and final. The motion was denied. The original settlement stood. The house on Carver Street remained Jacob's. Olivia's legal team filed a brief notice of intent to appeal and then went quiet. The appeal never materialized. The records of the judicial inquiry into Rebecca Collins became part of the public court file. The journalist who had been in the back row on that Thursday morning wrote a second piece, longer, more detailed, more carefully sourced than the first, and it ran in the paper 3 days after Judge Briggs's ruling. It did not go far beyond the county, but it went far enough. Rebecca Collins resigned from the bench 4 weeks later, citing personal reasons. The investigation into her conduct continued regardless of her resignation. Olivia did not make a public statement. She stopped appearing at the events she had frequented. The people who had been in her orbit pulled back in the quiet, gradual way that social circles contract around someone whose story has been publicly examined and found to be built on something that wasn't true. She had not been charged with anything. She had not been formally sanctioned beyond losing the case. But she had spent years constructing a version of events that required other people to believe the worst about Jacob Miller, and that version had now been measured against the record and had not survived the comparison. That was its own consequence, and it would follow her in ways that no court order could fully capture. Jacob received Judge Briggs's written ruling by email, forwarded from Sutton's office with a short note, "It's done. The house is yours." He read it at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the same way he had read the original lawsuit carefully twice, making sure he understood what it said before he allowed himself to feel anything about it. Then he set his phone face down on the table and sat with the quiet of the house around him. The furnace he had replaced himself was running in the basement. The garden along the south wall was dormant for the winter, but would come back in the spring the same as it always did. The front porch he had repainted twice was right outside the door. He had known from the beginning that the house was his. He had never needed a ruling to confirm that. What the ruling gave him was something different, the confirmation that the truth, given enough time and enough people willing to stand up for it, without being asked, was still capable of being heard. In the climate of those proceedings, with everything that had been arranged against him, that was not a small thing. When Jacob walked out of the building after meeting with Sutton to sign the final paperwork, the late November air was cold and flat and carried the smell of coming snow. He pulled his jacket closed and walked toward the parking lot. And there, along the corridor outside the building's main exit, standing on both sides of the walkway, were people he recognized. Ruth Harding in her heavy winter coat. Frank Doyle with his hands in his jacket pockets. Sandra Pierce still in her scrubs from a morning shift. Margaret Webb with her reading glasses pushed up on her head the way she always wore them when she wasn't reading. Dale Cooper in his work jacket with the hardware store logo on the chest. Others behind them, faces from the neighborhood from years of ordinary mornings and ordinary Saturdays and ordinary acts of help given without expectation of return. They were not making a scene. They were simply standing there the way people stand when they want someone to know they are present and that their presence means something. Some of them clapped. Some of them simply nodded. Frank Doyle reached out and put a hand briefly on Jacob's shoulder as he passed, and Jacob covered Frank's hand with his own for a moment, before moving on. He walked through them slowly, not because he was performing anything, but because he wanted to see their faces clearly and carry the memory of them exactly as they were. Not the courtroom, not the ruling, not any piece of paper. These people, this corridor, this cold, late November morning with its smell of snow and the sound of hands coming together in the gray air outside a courthouse in Dayton, Ohio. He got in his truck. The engine turned over on the second try, the same as it always did. The crack in the passenger window caught the flat winter light in the same familiar way. He pulled out of the lot and drove home through streets he had driven 1,000 times, past houses he knew, past the block where Frank lived, past the end of the road, where Ruth's light was already on in the window. Behind him, the people on the walkway dispersed back into their ordinary lives, the same lives they had always been living, the same lives that Jacob Miller had touched in small and unglamorous ways without ever expecting anything back. That was the thing about a reputation built from quiet actions over many years. It doesn't announce itself, doesn't ask for recognition. It just stands up when it's needed, and it doesn't sit back down until the truth has been heard.